In the spring of 1945, a bus full of captured German nurses rolled into a prisoner camp deep in Texas. They expected vengeance, barbed wire, punishment, humiliation. But what greeted them instead stopped them cold. Before the gates even opened, they smelled it. Bacon, coffee, and warm bread drifting through the dawn. These women had come from a world of starvation and ruins. Yet inside their enemy's camp, they would find food, medicine, and humanity they didn't think possible. This is the story of how the smell of breakfast shattered Nazi propaganda forever. Subscribe now, because what happens next is almost unbelievable. Before dawn on a warm spring morning in 1945, a bus rolled through the dusty roads of Texas, carrying a handful of German Red Cross nurses. The war had already devoured their homeland, cities in ruins, hospitals starving for medicine, families scattered. For days, the women had expected the moment of reckoning. They whispered of American vengeance, of punishment for serving the right. When the bus finally slowed before a long stretch of barbed wire and wooden guard towers, their fear was suffocating. Engines idled. A soldier shouted an order. Then, as the bus door swung open, something strange happened. The first thing they noticed wasn't the guards or rifles. It was the air. Thick, heavy, alive with the smell of food. Real food. Coffee, bitter and rich, drifting through the early light. Butter melting on an unseen pan. And something none of them had smelled in years. Bacon. One nurse whispered, "Fleisch," meat, as though the word itself might bring punishment. Her friend gave a trembling laugh. Impossible. For months, their meals had been gray bread stretched with sawdust and watery soup boiled from scraps. Meat was a dream from another life. Yet here, in the land of their enemy, the smell of breakfast filled the air as if the war didn't exist. When the women stepped down from the bus, gravel crunched under their worn boots. They braced for shouting, for humiliation. But the voices they heard were calm, the commands firm but not cruel. "This way, ladies. Keep together." The guards' faces were stern, not hateful. The rising Texas sun painted the camp in soft pink and gold. Smoke drifted lazily from a mess hall chimney. Somewhere inside, eggs cracked against a skillet. The women exchanged uncertain glances, their fear colliding with confusion. One murmured, "This cannot be real." But it was. Their first few breaths of freedom's enemy air carried not hate, but the scent of mercy. They were led across the yard, past fences glinting in the morning light, into a wooden building that smelled of soap and steel trays. The nurses walked in silence, each expecting the moment when the illusion would break, when the kindness would vanish, replaced by barking guards and cold rations. But that moment never came. The mess hall buzzed with quiet order. American cooks moved behind counters, pouring coffee into tin mugs and sliding plates across the line. The nurses clutched their trays with shaking hands, unsure how to react. Then came the meal. Bread still warm, eggs fried and golden, and in the center of each plate, a single strip of bacon. The sight alone was enough to make one of the women cover her mouth. It looked too perfect, too generous, too American. For a long time, no one touched it. The war had taught them that such things came with a price. One nurse whispered, "Maybe they want to make us sick." Another replied softly, "Or they want us to see what we lost." But hunger has no politics. Eventually, a trembling hand lifted a fork, and the first bite brought silence. The salt, the smoke, the fat, it was overwhelming. The taste reached into memories buried under years of bombings and hunger. a kitchen from childhood, a Sunday table before the war, a father's laughter. Some of the women began to cry, not from fear, but from the cruel kindness of remembrance. When an American nurse passed by offering more coffee, one of the Germans looked up in disbelief. "Is this allowed?" she asked. The nurse simply nodded. That morning, the barbed wire didn't disappear, but it blurred, softened by the strange human warmth of food. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was something close. The first moment they realized the enemy wasn't what they had been told. Days inside the camp began to blend together, stitched into a rhythm that none of the nurses had expected. There were roll calls at sunrise, meals served with military precision, and the distant hum of trucks bringing supplies from the outside world. For women who had come from a nation collapsing under bomb raids, the sheer normalcy of it all was disorienting. The fences were real, high, crowned with coiled wire, patrolled by guards. But life inside them carried an order, and calm they hadn't felt in years. The camp's rules were firm but predictable. There were no beatings, no random cruelty. The guards enforced discipline without sadism, speaking through routine instead of rage. At first, the nurses mistook this restraint for manipulation. Surely it was a trick, a way to lower their guard before the punishment came. But it didn't. Each morning, the smell of breakfast returned. Each evening, the sky flared orange above the horizon, while the Americans passed out letters, some even laughing softly among themselves. At night, the nurses lay in bunks lined with clean sheets and thin mattresses. The air smelled faintly of soap and desert dust. Hilda, the youngest among them, whispered into the dark, "This can't last. They'll take it away." No one answered. Deep down, they feared she might be right. Yet each dawn, the coffee still steamed, the bread still appeared, and the calm held. Around the camp, they began to notice small details that unsettled them more than any guard tower could. The Americans moved with quiet confidence, well-fed, well-supplied, their uniforms spotless. They joked as they worked, unafraid of shortages or raids. To the Germans, it was like stepping into a parallel world, one untouched by desperation. They had lived through blackout curtains, bomb sirens, and ration cards. Here, even prisoners seemed to live better than civilians back home. In the evenings, they gathered near the barrack windows, watching the guards change shifts. One of the women muttered, "They don't even seem angry at us." Another replied, "Why would they be? They've already won." The realization settled heavily. For all their fear of America's power, none of them had imagined it would look like this. Not cruelty, but abundance. Letters from home hadn't arrived yet, but rumors had. They'd heard whispers that in other camps, prisoners worked on farms, earning small wages. Some were even allowed to attend church services or watch films. At first, the nurses dismissed it as propaganda. But then, one morning, they saw it with their own eyes. A truckload of German men being driven out beyond the wire, shovels and gloves in hand, heading toward the fields. The guards waved them off casually, as if it were normal. The women watched in silence. It was the first time they saw freedom so near, and so strangely gentle. That night, Erica wrote in her notebook, "We are prisoners, yet treated as guests of discipline. America's strength is not its weapons, but its calm." The thought terrified her more than any battlefield ever had. For the nurses of the collapsing Reich, captivity was supposed to be a punishment. But as they watched life unfold within those fences, the order, the food, the quiet, another fear began to creep in. What if captivity in this place felt safer than freedom ever could. A week after their arrival, the women were told they would be put to work. The announcement came during roll call, the guard's voice steady and formal. Medical personnel, step forward. The German nurses obeyed out of habit more than hope, their minds filled with images of field hospitals, mud floors, bloody rags, the smell of rot and iodine. They expected the same filth, the same desperation they had known in Europe. Instead, what they found when they entered the camp infirmary stopped them cold. The room smelled clean, sharp with alcohol and soap. Sunlight poured through the windows, glinting off polished instruments laid neatly in rows. Shelves overflowed with supplies: gauze, cotton, antiseptic, bandages wrapped in crisp white paper. And there, in a glass-fronted cabinet, bottles of penicillin, dozens of them. The nurses froze. In Germany, penicillin was legend. It was the miracle drug no one could get, reserved only for the highest-ranking officers or propaganda darlings. Entire hospitals went months without seeing a single vial. And yet here, in a prisoner of war camp, it was stacked like milk bottles in a pantry. Erica, the most experienced of the group, whispered, "They have more medicine here than we had for an entire army." Her voice trembled, not in fear, but disbelief. An American nurse with auburn hair approached, her tone firm but professional. "You'll help here," she said slowly, making sure they understood. No shortages. No excuses. She handed them boxes of supplies, clean, new, abundant. The German women obeyed, falling into the rhythm of work, washing instruments, folding linens, tending to fellow prisoners under watchful eyes. But the shock deepened when they realized who they were helping treat. It wasn't just German soldiers, but Italians, even American troops recovering from wounds. Everyone received care, even the enemy. The Americans didn't boast or taunt, they simply did their jobs. To the German women, raised under a system that glorified suffering and hierarchy, this quiet equality was unthinkable. Each task became a small revelation. The steady hum of refrigeration units that never failed. The nurses' steady hands. The unspoken assumption that life, any life, was worth saving. That night, back in their barracks, the women lay awake, replaying what they'd seen. "Do you understand?" Hilda whispered. "They treat everyone as if life still matters." Erica nodded slowly. "Maybe that's why they're winning." In the silence that followed, no one disagreed. The next shock didn't come from medicine or food. It came from a face. One morning, as the German nurses worked inside the infirmary, a new figure entered the ward carrying a tray of tin mugs filled with steaming coffee. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture straight, her tone firm yet kind. She spoke English slowly, clearly. "Coffee?" The German women froze. The nurse was black. For a moment, the room stood still. The German nurses stared in disbelief, their training and indoctrination colliding with the world in front of them. Back in Germany, they had been told over and over that people of color were inferior, unfit for authority, subhuman. Yet here was a woman wearing the same U.S. Army insignia as her white counterparts, giving orders, commanding respect, and being obeyed without hesitation. One of the German women, Erica, almost flinched when the nurse offered her a mug. The woman's voice was calm, steady, almost motherly. "Go ahead, take it." Erica hesitated before whispering, "Danke." The nurse smiled faintly, as though recognizing the tension. It was a small moment, but for the German women, it shattered something fundamental. They had been taught that America was chaotic, degenerate, ruled by racial mixing and moral decay. But this scene, this simple act of a black woman serving as a professional with dignity and respect, told a different story entirely. As days passed, the women saw more of what their propaganda had hidden. Black soldiers patrolling the gates, their boots gleaming, their demeanor proud. They gave orders in firm voices, and white soldiers followed without hesitation. The Germans whispered among themselves, unable to reconcile what they saw. One nurse murmured, "They told us these people were slaves." Another replied, "Then why do they wear the uniform of the victors?" In the evenings, those images replayed in their minds. The nurse pouring coffee, the guard reading roll call, the quiet cooperation between races they had been taught could never exist. It wasn't kindness alone that stunned them. It was the collapse of everything they thought they knew about the world. One night, Hilda said softly to the others, "Maybe everything they told us was a lie." No one dared to answer. But in their silence, truth settled like dust after an explosion. Quiet, heavy, and undeniable. The women had arrived in America expecting cruelty and punishment. Instead, they found a world that functioned on discipline, abundance, and, to their astonishment, equality. And for the first time, they began to wonder if the enemy they had feared was more civilized than the country that sent them to war. For the German nurses, comfort had become its own kind of torment. The bacon, the medicine, even the kindness, all of it began to gnaw at their conscience. How could they, prisoners of war, eat hot meals while their families in Hamburg and Dresden starved under rubble? The contradiction was unbearable. At night, they whispered about it in their bunks. "Maybe it's a trick," Marta said one evening, her voice sharp with suspicion. "They want to soften us, make us forget who we are." Hilda shook her head. "Or maybe, this is who they are." Her words hung heavy in the darkness. The next morning, their doubts deepened. During work detail, one of the American medics, a young man with rolled-up sleeves, made small talk while disinfecting equipment. When Marta asked why they treated prisoners so well, his answer was simple: "Because the Geneva rules say we should. And because if our boys were captured, we'd want the same." The logic was so casual it stunned her. In Germany, prisoners were beaten, starved, forgotten. Here, they were fed, clothed, and even given letters from home. Was this morality or strategy? Mercy or propaganda? The nurses started to notice how carefully everything inside the camp ran. The daily routines, the steady supply lines, the structure. There was no chaos, no desperation. The guards followed orders, not emotions. They enforced discipline, but never struck without reason. For women raised in a collapsing nation of shortages and violence, this efficiency felt almost alien. Each small kindness chipped away at what they'd been taught. A guard handed one woman a sewing kit instead of scolding her for a torn sleeve. Another guard, seeing Hilda drop a tray, simply helped her pick it up without a word. It was too humane, too consistent to be an act. But mercy came with guilt. Every time they drank coffee, they thought of mothers boiling water for soup made of potato skins. Every time they lay on a clean mattress, they pictured children shivering in bombed-out basements. Erica wrote in her notebook, "I fear I will forget what suffering feels like. And that makes me afraid of myself." The women began to realize something more disturbing than captivity. They were living better as prisoners than they ever had as loyal servants of the Reich. And that realization didn't bring relief. It brought shame. The day the letters arrived, the entire camp fell silent. A U.S. sergeant walked through the yard holding a canvas bag heavy with envelopes. calling out names in his deep southern drawl. For weeks, the German nurses had wondered whether their families were even alive. Now, as each name echoed through the humid Texas air, hands trembled, eyes filled, hearts raced. Hilda was the first to open hers. The paper inside was thin, the ink faint, the edges smeared with dust and ash. Her mother's handwriting was uneven, a sign of age or hunger or grief. "We are alive," it began, but only just. "The house is gone. The bakery is gone. Your brother. We have no word." The words blurred as tears fell onto the page. Another nurse read that her sister traded jewelry for bread. One learned that her father collapsed at a munitions factory, exhausted and malnourished. A third discovered that her hometown no longer existed, erased in a single night of bombing. Around the barracks, muffled sobs filled the air. When they looked down at their plates that evening, beans, cornbread, coffee, the food turned to guilt in their mouths. Some refused to eat. Others forced it down in silence, ashamed of their own survival. That night, the women gathered in the dim barracks, reading their letters aloud in fragments, comparing censored sentences. Thick black lines covered words, names, places, details, as if to hide the full truth of Germany's ruin. Yet enough slipped through to crush them. They realized they were safer, healthier, and better fed in captivity than their own families were in freedom. When the time came to write back, none of them knew what to say. They were told their letters would be censored, so they wrote carefully. "We are safe. We have food. Do not worry." But behind those simple words, an unspoken truth lingered. They were prisoners, yet they were living in a version of mercy that their homeland had forgotten existed. Hilda folded her letter and whispered to Erica, "How can I tell my mother I'm warm when she sleeps under rubble?" Erica didn't answer. She simply stared at the barbed wire outside their window and said quietly, "Sometimes I think the cage is kinder than the world beyond it." And in that moment, every woman in the room understood. Captivity had become their conscience, forcing them to see that the empire they served had collapsed not just in battle, but in humanity itself. By the summer of 1945, the women had stopped seeing their confinement as punishment and started seeing it as revelation. The daily rhythm of camp life, the food, the medicine, the steady voices of American nurses began to feel less like routine and more like a quiet demonstration. America wasn't simply winning the war with weapons, it was winning it with ideas. Every act of fairness, every cup of coffee poured without cruelty, every clean sheet folded on a prisoner's bed. It all carried a message. This is what civilization looks like. The German nurses began to understand that they were part of something deliberate. The United States wanted them to see that dignity, equality, and restraint could be more powerful than the Reich's iron discipline. It was propaganda, yes, but it was a kind their own nation had forgotten how to make. One afternoon, while helping in the infirmary, Hilda overheard two American officers talking quietly. One said, "Let them go home, knowing we treated them right. The story will travel faster than any bullet." The words sank into her chest like a stone. She realized then that mercy wasn't weakness, it was strategy. America's generosity wasn't an accident. It was a weapon crafted to outlast the war itself. Still, that knowledge didn't lessen the confusion. The women couldn't decide if they should be grateful or angry. Marta called it manipulation. They feed us so we forget. But Erica, who had seen the inside of Nazi hospitals, shook her head. If this is a lie, It's a better one than the truth we lived. Outside the wire, the war was collapsing. They heard rumors that Hitler was dead, that Berlin had fallen, that the Reich itself was dissolving into dust. Inside the Texas camp, life continued. Breakfast, roll call, work in the infirmary. The contradiction was surreal. The empire that promised them glory was gone. Yet the enemy that captured them gave them a future. The women began to sense what America wanted them to take home. Not just stories of food and fairness, but the dangerous seed of doubt. A thought that would bloom years later, in a rebuilt Germany. Maybe strength doesn't come from fear. Maybe power doesn't require cruelty. And as that idea took root, it did something no army could. It began to rewrite them from within. When the war ended and the gates finally opened, the nurses didn't cheer. They stepped onto the buses that would take them away from the camp in silence, clutching the few belongings they had. A folded uniform, a comb, a small notebook, and in some cases, a letter from an American nurse who had quietly wished them luck. The engines rumbled to life, and the fences slipped away behind them. But what none of the women could leave behind were the smells, sounds, and contradictions of captivity. The coffee, the soap, the quiet dignity. The journey back to Germany was long and haunting. As the ships crossed the Atlantic, many stood on deck staring into the gray horizon, wondering what kind of home still existed for them. When they finally arrived, they found a land unrecognizable. Cities were hollowed skeletons. Streets once lined with bakeries were now rubble and ash. Children begged for food. Men wore the same broken look as the ruins around them. The nurses quickly realized that the real prison was not the one they had left behind. It was the country they had returned to. In America, they had been treated as enemies, yet as humans. Here, they were treated as traitors, as women who had survived too well. When they spoke of the camp, of bacon and coffee, of medicine and fairness, people looked at them with disbelief, even anger. Some accused them of lying, others of shame. "You talk like you miss the enemy," one man spat. But they couldn't deny the truth. Captivity had changed them. They had gone into war believing in a nation built on lies and fear, and come out of it having glimpsed another way of living. Imperfect, contradictory, but undeniably freer. Hilda later wrote in her journal, "I lost faith in Germany inside an American fence, and I found faith in humanity there instead." Years later, when they were old women, they still remembered that first morning in Texas, the smell of bacon, the warmth of coffee, the sight of a black nurse offering kindness that their own leaders said was impossible. They told their grandchildren the story, not as humiliation, but as proof that even in war, dignity can survive. And so, their captivity became a paradox. They had been prisoners, but within those fences, they discovered what freedom really meant. If stories like this remind you that humanity can shine even in history's darkest corners, make sure to subscribe, because these are the moments the world must never forget.